So here in Willington, Connecticut, a old cemetery, reestablished in 1899, as you can see by the sign. But this is a very much a historical colonial era cemetery with stones dating back, for births in the 17th century and deaths up to the 1900s, early 20th century. So we come to Old East Cemetery, for a couple of reasons. One was expected, one rather unexpected. This is another case of suspected vampirism, and it rather surprised me that Willington, Connecticut, actually could possibly have its own case of vampirism. We've seen evidence in Cumberland, Foster, Exeter, Hopeville, Jewett City, all those cases from Mercy Brown to Abigail Staples of individuals who had suffered from tuberculosis and were, because of the rather secluded area in which they found themselves, superstition reigned, and individuals who had died and had infected other people became suspected of launching spiritual attacks on family members. And so the consumption or tuberculosis, the bacterial infection, which causes that wasting disease, the languor, the paleness, the coughing of blood, the red eyes, all what could be construed by some individuals as being an attack from another realm, another plane, was in fact just a well-diagnosed illness. But for places that were extremely secluded, where superstition and myth and word of mouth, where these old ideas spread, vampirism was a much more plausible, but was one of the most feared scenarios in terms of why people were dying, in particular entire families, because being a contagious disease, an incredibly contagious disease, it would attack family member to family member. So this is the area here, and it's a little bit anticlimactic, I should say, because we don't actually have the grave of anyone that was involved, but we have the family plot here, and for a number of reasons there are suspicions that the graves may be here, in fact, in this cemetery, and just not visible to us. So let's talk about the case a little bit. It involves a family, the Johnson family. As you can see, zoom in here on some of these stones here. This is Abel Johnson. He would be not a contemporary. He would have been very young at the time of the events that we'll describe. His Deborah, his wife. And this is a rather sad, actually a sad portion of the family too. Here's Truman Johnson. He was only 15 when he died in 1822. Eliza, she was only 2 years old. She died in 1816. Truman died 1822. And then he had a 20-month-old daughter, Eunice, who died in 1805. 3 children that Abel and Deborah had, and all 3 of them had died by 1820s. Deborah's stone is broken, and go to the other side. Perhaps we can say she'd lived until 1857. In fact, both parents survived all 3 children, which is rather interesting. We'll talk about what happened in terms of this legend, but we don't have any actual evidence to connect them to what occurred. So the details come from a report by an individual named John Warner Barker. It was a report published in 1836. And it was basically almost a statement, published statement from an individual named Moses Holmes, who was a Willington resident. And the date of the statement was 1784. And Mr. Holmes claims to have been an eyewitness to the account of the exhumation of several family members of a man named Isaac Johnson. And you see we have Abel and Deborah here, but we don't have an Isaac. I've looked around this entire graveyard here, and there are a couple more Johnsons buried here, but none of them match the name of Isaac Johnson, nor his wife. Johnson had 2 children, at least 2 that we know about, and they became ill of tuberculosis, consumption, whatever the locals had diagnosed it. 2 doctors were brought in after the children died. Doctors are just referred to as West and Grant. In fact, Mr. Holmes here, the eyewitness to the exhumation, later claimed that these guys were quacks. They weren't reputable doctors at all. The exhumation occurred a year and 11 months after their death, at least the death of one of the children. And it became necessary because Mr. Johnson himself began to become sick. He had contracted the disease, and as a result of that, he brought in these doctors. He, fearing his own mortality at this point, having seen his children died, he brought in these doctors to help him, an alternative cause. And so these 2 doctors recommended digging up the bodies of the 2 children and utilizing a very old technique of looking for signs that they had been disturbed in their place of rest. In particular, he wanted to look for, and this is rather different than the other cases, sprouts or vines that had invaded the casket. And the vines would have, in particular, if they had grown into the casket and through vital organs, this was a symptom or a signal that perhaps something was not right, that the spiritual attack were underway. Again, this is all coming from myths, superstitions that were passed down. And in fact, there are 2 cases, one in New Hampshire and one in Vermont, in which this type of thing had happened. We're going to look here at this is Eunice, wife of Captain Abel Johnson. There's actually no mention of this must have been the second wife. I'm sorry, this is the second wife of Abel Johnson. Look at the stone masonry on that tombstone, by the way. There's no mention of him, Abel, being a captain on his stone, which is just interesting. Okay, so according to the eyewitness, and this is just a single eyewitness report, and this is all we have to go on, the graves of the 2 children were dug up, and some vines or roots were found underneath the graves. As far as we know, they hadn't actually invaded the bodies or invaded the casket, but they were underneath. Apparently that was good enough. What then happened was that the bodies were burned as a result of that. And community allegedly was notified of what was going on. People are afraid, they're more likely to believe in these local legends. So Mr. Holmes claimed that the rest of the community was notified. We don't have any evidence that was true. Isaac Johnson, his wife actually was named Elizabeth Beale, and we know their 2 children were Amos and Elizabeth. They are not buried here. In fact, in searching this entire cemetery here, their bodies are not marked. Isaac died soon after, according to this record, and his body is unknown. The presence of his body, his 2 children, and his wife are unknown. So what do we learn from this? Well, there are some bits of credible evidence in this eyewitness report. One, the ritual itself, the vines. Although it's new for our vampire legends, it actually springs up again in 2 other cases, as I mentioned. The second is the burning of the body as well. The second, its connection with tuberculosis. And I should, if I haven't mentioned it yet, the time period of this was 1784. This predated scares that happened in Foster, and it was right around the time period of Abigail Staples, actually. In fact, this may have been slightly before that. Predated Mercy Brown, predated Sarah Tillinghast. So this report has some validity to it because it's one of the first reports of this type of vampirism that we've encountered here. So if you think of like witness contamination, well, maybe not. Maybe this is actually an authentic record of a suspected vampire in Willington. And of course, again, but it's suspected vampire with an asterisk on it because we know it's just tuberculosis. So where are the bodies? So that's the overwhelming question. Where are the graves? There's a number of theories here, and I got to give Mr. Thomas God, I'm gonna mess up his name. So here, I'm gonna give Mr. Thomas D'Agostino a little bit of credit here because I hadn't heard of this case until he had written about it. But apparently, this was researched very well by Dr. Michael Bell and our old friend Nicholas Bellantoni, the Connecticut State archaeologist. He's actually currently working on a case of bodies being found in, I think it's New Haven, if I'm not mistaken. So they examined the cemetery and they came to the same conclusion that we did, that the bodies aren't here. And some of the explanations are, you see this little gap here. This is the Johnson family plot. There's this big gap here where there are no graves. Is it possible that their grave is somewhere in here? We look around the cemetery, we see over here, we see other gaps as well. This one's on a rather bit of an incline here. There's a gap right there, but the slope there is pretty substantial. But this is a relatively flat area in here. I'm just going to zoom around, show you. You'd think that they would have utilized this space, and it's very, very possible that what had happened was that perhaps the family was not of great means, and they couldn't afford very expensive tombstones, and the stones perhaps made of wood. It's probably doubtful, but maybe of materials that were less than substantial than Mr. Abel's here, or his wife. Even his wife Deborah has cleaved into 3 pieces. Perhaps they weathered away. Maybe they were very small tombstones, and they're not here anymore. Another possibility is that the family was buried on the Johnson property, and there are fortunately no land records to intimate where that is. We don't exactly know where the Johnson farm was, so it's somewhat of a mystery as to where it is. Is it a fantasy? Is this not a real case of vampirism? Are their bodies in fact buried here, but their gravestones had vanished over time? Or are they buried somewhere else? We don't know. I think, though, that the date of the report seems rather valid. If it had come after some of the more famous vampire cases, I would have suspected that perhaps there was a bit of contamination there, that somebody telling a little bit of a far-fetched story. But it appears that this, because it's a very, very early report, that this could in fact be authentic. Now, what would really authenticate this if there were other cases of consumption, tuberculosis within the community, and we don't have those. But you could look at some of the gravestones and look for some patterns. We know that tuberculosis attacks the very young. Attacks older people as well. It's contagious to everybody. But we know that the children have the least strong resistance to it. In fact, they would die very quickly. We've seen that in the Tillinghast. Mother, father survived. All 8 or 9 children died. So if you look around the graveyard and you actually look for families that had children dying very young around this time period, then you got something. And so there actually may be some evidence of that here. Now here's a guy named Isaac Root. He died in 1778. Again, the report here is 1784, so this would have been a little bit older. He was 39 years old, by no means a child, but died at a fairly young age. He wasn't part of the military. Died at a relatively young age, around the time period. Now that may be like a stretching it, but there are other Roots buried here who died very young as well. And let's see if I can find one here. Right here. This is Ethel, son of Lieutenant Nathan and Hannah Root, died June 1788 at the age of 17, 4 years after the alleged incident here. Here's Mr. Well, here's looks like the son. Okay, Mr. Eliezer. 2 of the words that go on together. Remember, F's and S's are synonymous in this old ancient writing. Ancient writing, colonial era writing. Eliezer, I think that's an R. Anyway, he was son of Nathan Root. He was 29 years old, died 1792. 1788 at 17, 1792 at 29, and let's go back to our original. (1778) at 39. Perhaps a little bit of a stretch, maybe not. Remember the Johnson family, the 3 kids who died? All died by 1820 at a very young age. Rather interesting. Now, I've looked around here. There was one other one. Was it the Fentons? I'm not sure. Let's take a quick look. There was one other possible, kind of bizarre series of deaths in a family here. And again, you look for the young. Here's Samuel, 23, died 1778. Again, a rather young person who died. And this is the Rugg family. Now, I didn't find any other Ruggs here. Okay, so this is the Topliff family. This is Mr. Stephen Topliff, son of Clement and Ruth, died 1788, 4 years after. He was 27 years old. Come down here. Here's Ruth, again, daughter of Clement and Ruth Topliff. Died 1777 at the age of 5. Now, I cannot read this one right here. This could very well be one of the other children, and it would be interesting to know here. If there was a date on here, it's impossible to read. This is another family that had 2 children die relatively close to one another. Again, this is a little bit of a stretch. Here's Ruth and Clement. And they both lived rather long, substantial lives, 82 and 81. Stretch, very possible. But we don't know. The report appears credible, but we know one thing: the Johnsons are not buried here.